Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this chat about inclusive education. In these sessions, we introduce you to someone in Canada who's been doing interesting things and has ideas about how inclusive education is working and how we can make it better. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm joined by my co-host, Diane Richler, who's the chair of the Inclusion International Project Catalyst for Inclusive Education that supports developments on a global level. Diane's a former executive vice president of what's now called Inclusion Canada and used to be called the Canadian Association for Community Living. Our colleague and co-host is Jackie Specht, who's the chair of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education at Western University in Ontario. And Jackie is a professor of education there and coordinates the work actually of a couple of dozen academics and researchers across Canada in projects that apply to inclusive education practice in our country. So today, I want to introduce you to our guest, Zana Lutfiyya. Zana is a former professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. She's now a senior scholar, which means that she's retired from being a professor, but continues to do things at the university with students in a number of ways. Zana, I met Zana actually more than 35 years ago when we were both at Syracuse University, and we lived around the corner from each other. And she did a very deep dive into the philosophy and knowledge about inclusion and building supports for people with disabilities to be part of their communities, and has been doing that for many, many years. She started as an activist in her own city, Winnipeg, where she returned to spend her academic career. So welcome to this chat, Zana. And like you, I'm kind of celebrating Syracuse Orangemen' wonderful participation in the Final Four competition this year. They've had two successful come from behind wins, with the coach's son, Buddy Boeheim, being the big star. And, you know, when 35 years ago, the dad was one of the most noted people on the campus, and I guess still is.
That's so true. They made it to the Sweet 16.
Did you attend basketball when you were at Syracuse at all?
I did. I would go to probably one game a year because students actually camped outside for 2 or 3 weeks before the student season's tickets went on sale. And I couldn't do that. I wasn't prepared to do that. So I would end up going to a game a year and watch the rest on TV.
Well, I actually did do that. So the one year that I was there, I did have season tickets, but often I was off to Canada and traveling across the country. So I didn't get to use them probably even half the time, but when I did, it was certainly exciting. Now, turning from Orangemen basketball to inclusion, can you just share with us, like, why did you leave Winnipeg and go to Syracuse to do a deep dive into this whole area of inclusion and equal rights for people with disabilities?
Well, two of my friends and colleagues here in Winnipeg, Jim Lapp and John Van Wellingham, and I decided that we should go to grad school because we were very concerned about what was happening for people with intellectual disabilities and the need for leadership at all levels. And one year we actually went on a busman's holiday and went to visit different universities. And John Van ended up going to Madison, Wisconsin, and got his master's degree with Lou Brown, then went to Idaho to work with one of the profs he met in Madison. And Jim Lapp got his master's degree with Tom Bellamy in Oregon. And as we were driving back across Western Canada during a snowstorm, John looked at me and said, well, I think you just need to go to Syracuse. I think that's probably going to be the best fit for you. And that's what I did. I applied and asked for Steve Taylor to be my advisor because I had read some of Steve's work and was really taken with it. And when I got to Syracuse for my master's degree, I was recruited into the doctoral program. And so that's why I ended up staying there. And it was a really good fit for me in terms of where, the people I ended up studying with, what they were doing and what I was interested in. And also, as you know, the group of doctoral students was an amazing group of people to spend a few years with, people literally from all over the world who had done and were doing all kinds of things. And so it was a pretty exciting time to be at Syracuse University in the 1980s.
Right. Was Burton Blatt there when you first arrived?
Yes, when I first arrived. So in my first year, I had the opportunity to take a course with Bert, and he had these coffee hours before class. So you would go and he would serve coffee and smoke a cigar in the dean's office, and we would get to listen to him talk. And that was pretty amazing. He died, unfortunately, in my second year, my first year in the doctoral program. And I was scheduled to take a course with him, which of course didn't happen. But I did have the chance to meet and take one course with Bert.
Well, I arrived just after he died, so I didn't get that privilege. So talk to us a little bit about what you've been up to in Canada since you've been back in Winnipeg and how it relates to building support or addressing issues around having schools be inclusive.
So I moved back to Winnipeg in 1992 to become a professor at the University of Manitoba. And I've been really lucky with my colleagues, first in special ed, and then several years ago, we renamed and regrouped, and now we're inclusive education. And I think that really reflects what has been happening in education in Manitoba, or at least the efforts of many educators to move from a wide variety of options, including segregated schools and self-contained classrooms in regular schools, if you will, to a much more inclusive model, where today most students in the province up until high school are fully included with supports. And in high school, it really depends on the division. So some divisions have made a big, clear commitment to including students in regular courses with supports, regular classrooms, but also other opportunities that are available to students like internships and stuff. And other school divisions, not as much. So with my colleagues at the U of M, we've really been working towards revamping the courses that we teach to pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, the focus of the graduate programs, to really pay attention to a much more inclusive approach, and to identify, those skills and experiences that pre-service and in-service teachers need to be able to make that move into inclusive ed.
So you and your colleagues who went on your field trip 35 more years ago, would you have been able to stay in Winnipeg and pursue studies that you had in mind? Not, of course, exactly the same people, but is it possible, you think, for people like you 35 years ago to stay in Winnipeg and study things related to inclusion?
No, for two reasons. Just taking myself as one example, my first degree had been in psychology, and I would not have been able to enter the Faculty of Education with the psych degree. In fact, I wouldn't have been able to enter the Faculty of Education until about 5 or 6 years ago. So if I had wanted to move into education, I would have had to take a whole new program, an undergraduate program, to do that. Also, the universities were very committed to segregated education. And so there were still segregated, most school divisions had a segregated school. And we're very, committed to that. And parents who wanted their children to have a much more integrated or inclusive experience literally had to go to court and make a big public hullabaloo. And in fact, many of those first families were successful by going to private schools, like the private Catholic schools or private. The first student with very significant disabilities who was included throughout her school career was in a small private school run in the country by the Dutch Reformed Church in that community.
But
So
it's changed. It's
oh,
changed.
it's huge. It's huge. And those communities, I think, did it because the person was already a member of their church community and
Right.
the family was a member. And that's why they did it. But it's changed now. Yes. I mean, now students more often than not go to their neighborhood schools, again, especially from kindergarten up until high school. In high school, within a school division, there can be a little more choice because of the different courses that different high schools offer. And so there's a bit of matching there, but yes, it's night and day, really, in the opportunities. And also we now have at the University of Manitoba, a post-secondary option for students with intellectual disabilities as well. That would have been unheard of.
Now, this change in Manitoba, would you say it's more bottom up or top down? Or I suppose the easy answer is a little both, but
Well,
teachers.
I think the two biggest promoters of change has been, well, the biggest promoter has been advocacy. And advocacy, first and foremost, from parents and parent groups. And secondly, from educators who became convinced of the benefits of inclusive education.
So it's more bottom up. It's not like leaders of Manitoba education decided one day that we've got a better idea and this is what it is.
No, I think eventually some people moved up through the ranks to become leaders and as educators, and then pushed for inclusion. And that was one of the reasons that, Jim, John, and I decided to go for a graduate education, because we thought there needed to be some leadership with the skills, able to pull some of this off. And so John eventually became responsible for inclusive ed for the largest school division in the province, Winnipeg School Division number 1, as it was then called. So that's how that happened. But really the prime mover was advocacy organizations.
Zana, it's interesting, you talk about sort of that elementary school is where inclusion seems to be working well. And yet there are, when you get into high school, there's still some school divisions that are struggling with it. And I think if you were to look across Canada, you would find the very same thing, and probably around the world. What is it about those school divisions that have been able to have more inclusive settings versus those that haven't within the province of Manitoba? Like, what's different? What do we have to do to be able to help those other school divisions along in terms of becoming more inclusive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think when I think back on the school divisions, first of all, there was a commitment made by school division leadership, and they became very clear about expectations of what would happen in schools. And then they had at least enough principals, vice principals, and then teachers, classroom teachers, and so on, who were committed. But there's no doubt that leadership at the divisional level is key, because not only do they have the expectations, but they can provide and reorganize existing supports in different ways. So the focus of training, who gets to go to the training, do they do it by a few people from each school across the division, or work with one or two schools to initiate a change? Is it just a school? Is it a one-year school project, or is it longer term? All that kind of stuff around training and supports and expectations. So I think educational leadership is key. And I think the research literature points to that as well, right?
Mhm.
Certainly divisions where there was a real respect for parents and for families. I think we saw more willingness to try some things that other divisions weren't so willing to try. So a recognition that families had a stake in this in a really important way. So that was another thing. Although, we do have families who have advocated for segregated educational opportunities for their sons and daughters as well. So, it's a bit of a struggle. I would also say that divisions that were smaller, geographically smaller, and population smaller, were among the first to take it up. And at the same time, divisions that were geographically larger but smaller populations out in the country were also the first because, and I remember talking to a teacher who said, we didn't have any other choice.
Mhm.
We couldn't be putting students in a bus and busing them for 3 hours to another comprehensive school. We had to educate them here in this community. And so we had to figure things out.
Right. So it's interesting, right? 'Cause it comes back to what Gordon was saying. Is it a top down or a bottom up? And it has to be a bit of both, but it
Yeah.
almost appears to me that, our provincial governments have to get on board and say, this is how it's going to be. And then it isn't up to those individual leaders in the divisions to figure out what to do. They're going to have to do it.
Well, and it's more than, we've had law in Manitoba that supports full inclusion, but that doesn't mean we have full inclusion.
Mhm.
And so, but I also agree that leadership from the provincial government, from the Minister of Education, is pretty crucial. And I would say that, about 15, actually, it's longer than that, 20 some years ago, we had a large round of amalgamations of school divisions, and some of the more inclusive school divisions got swallowed up. And we lost the real leading edge. And the province has just announced last week another reorganization plan where all the school divisions in Winnipeg will be one school division. And I think many people are worried that the largest school division, Winnipeg School Division, everyone will end up using their model. And they're probably among the least committed to inclusive education. So there's a lot of concern around that.
Can I switch gears for a second, Zana?
Sure.
I think that a lot of your work has really focused on social participation. And what I remember of even first getting to know you many, many years ago, a lot of your focus was really on making sure that people who had disabilities not only were physically part of their communities, but really felt that they were part of their communities, that really felt that they belonged. Can you link that to being within a faculty of education? What do you think that your commitment to individuals' relationships, what's the relevance of that for inclusion in schools? And what are the implications?
Yeah, you're correct, because most of my work had been with adults and looking at the experiences of adults and what really made a difference for them. I think a couple things. One thing is that I recognized how important it was for schools to teach certain things and also to promote certain things that helped prepare children with disabilities and children without disabilities to learn how to be with each other and to be classmates, to be friends, to be teammates on teams and all that kind of stuff. And that once they develop those skills, if you will, it made it a lot easier for people after school to know how to be with each other and to live with each other because they had done that through their school years. So I really began to appreciate the importance of school as a place for children and youth to meet each other. And I think this is true not just for children with and without disabilities, but for children who, new Canadians who come to Canada, so on and so forth. They literally learn how to live with each other. And I think that was tremendous, a tremendous opportunity. The other thing that I, in particular, one of my other colleagues initiated was the opportunity for adults with intellectual disabilities to come to university as auditing students, which is a role that's available to any Manitoba resident, and so we built on that. We used that existing role, and we now support in any given year 9 to 11 students, and the population of students is 30,000. And that really has helped us put into practice our own beliefs. But also, when we start talking with high school teachers and educators about what can be done in high schools, it's become really clear. If we can do some of this at university, you can do this in high school. And so looking at how to involve students with each other has been a real focus of the Campus Life program here at the U of M. And again, looking at ways for students with and without disabilities to come together, to do things together, to provide them with opportunities to get to know each other and develop friendships or other connections with each other. That's, I think, a pretty clear way of putting some of my interest and research into, very visible practice, if you will, or day-to-day life for some people.
And is that something that needs extra support, or like, how does that happen in schools? Whose responsibility is it? Who can make it happen?
Well, I think it's probably not the responsibility of one person. So we often, or think in the past, thought of the quote unquote special ed teacher, whatever the definition of that role has been, to do a lot of stuff. But frankly, they need to work with the other teachers as well to bring it about. And so in one class that I taught, students who were teachers had to do a change project of one sort or another. And what many of them did, because they were special ed teachers, was they recruited 1 or 2 other teachers in their school to involve students together to do something within the school. So one teacher helped students start a school newspaper, and they paired students with and without disabilities to work together to learn about and then put together a newspaper. So I think teachers have learned that they need to involve their colleagues outside of inclusive education, if you will. And I think that's been a huge change in perspective.
Yeah, that really is huge, right? Because I think when we look at our schools, often there are certain opportunities that are only available for kids with disabilities, and then nobody else is allowed to be involved
That's
with
right.
that. And so, I think that idea of, if we think about high school especially, there's so many opportunities for kids. And so it's just a matter of it's the responsibility of all teachers to include all
That's right.
students in their school. It's a great example with that newspaper.
Yeah, and it was great. And just a very quick example from that, a mother of one of the young men who had an intellectual disability called the teacher and said, "Where is my son and what have you done with him?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "He came home last night and he asked me how to do laundry because he had to wash his blue shirt for school the next day." And so, and he was insistent, and she had to show him how to do his laundry and iron that shirt. And the teacher said, "Well, you may not like the answer, but he was a sports reporter with a young woman in the school who's turned out to be a very popular young woman in the school. And she had commented on how much she liked him in that blue shirt." And so the teacher said it was a girl. That was his motivation. But
As it is for many.
Yes, as it is for many, exactly. Very typical experience. But clearly, so his mother said, fine, he's going to do his own laundry from now on. And but that's how we learn. And
So Zana, looking back from the beginning of your association with these issues, when you said parent advocacy was quite strong, and I think you had fairly active community advocacy associations at that time.
yes.
How do you see that today? Is the ability of parents to work together and to influence what's happening either in their local school still strong, and how can it be improved?
Well, I think especially provincially and to a lesser extent locally, the inclusion, or what used to be community living organizations, are not as active as they once were, especially at the provincial level. And some of the local associations are service providers, and their primary identity has become one of service provision. That's not true in Winnipeg or Brandon, but it is true elsewhere. I think parents have formed a variety of other groups, often around very particular issues, rather than a broader advocacy platform that spans the lifespan. And I think there are some advantages to that, especially if you have a single issue you want to address, but there are disadvantages to that approach.
Right, that's interesting. So it's more like guerrilla warfare than,
Yes.
army against army. And they
Yeah,
form and
well,
reform and group and regroup based on the issue.
I think that's a good analogy. And I think that I was certainly, brought up within the community living movement, right? In
Right.
so many ways. And we were afforded very rich education about issues people faced from birth for their whole lifespan. And I think now, parents are surprised every time their child moves from one, part of life to the next. They're surprised that they have to do this all over again. And I think in the broader advocacy context, that was much more understood.
One very different issue. I had an opportunity to visit Syracuse when you and Gordon were there. And one of the things that struck me was how involved the students in your programs were in the community, in services for people with disabilities, whether it was working or volunteering. It was an experience that I didn't see nearly as much of in the Canadian context. There seemed to be a real schism between what was happening in universities and what was happening in the community. Has that changed here? Do you know what I mean in terms of what was happening in Syracuse?
Yes, I do know what you mean. I think there are many professors who were involved and in the community and expected their students. Certainly my advisor, Steve Taylor, both as a student and then after when I did my postdoc with him, there was an expectation that we would use some of our time towards advocacy that wouldn't be paid for. But he was able to provide us with some resources, the use of machines and computers and all that kind of stuff, moral support. And that was really seen as, I think that was one of the hallmarks of the program, was that level of involvement. It's hard to speak for other universities in Canada, but at the U of M, my colleagues and I have tried to build that into some of the courses and expectations in our courses. So at the doctoral level, we have a field experience course where we expect students to take on, to make a contribution into the community as a form of leadership development for them, but to actually provide something concrete to a group, or usually a group or an organization in the community. So 2 of my doctoral students helped in the end to write policies for the provincial government, for the Ministry of Education, as part of that course, just as examples. Another student rewrote the curriculum for a course in the Disability and Community Services program at Red River College, with the faculty there involved, but she took that on as part of her project. So we've tried to build that in. It's a bit more difficult because almost all of our graduate students are full-time educators. And at Syracuse, we were all full-time students by and large.
Okay, with that, that's the last word. Our time is up for our chat, Zana. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And I remind people that Zana is one of our associates in our network of associates of wise and experienced people across the country. You can check out her page on our Inclusive Education Canada website. And we continue to be interested in following the things you're doing, Zana. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.